Hey everyone, welcome back to Grace Note Forge. So this is part 2 of the Filigree Pendant design series, and in this video I'm going to be going over how I plan out an RTV mold using a homemade wax injector. And I thought that this design would be a good example because I'm expecting to have a few issues, but more on that later. If you're interested in seeing how I carved this design, I'll leave a link down in the description to part 1. And just a quick disclaimer, I'm not an expert, I just really enjoy making things and finding out what works for me. And I'm sure a lot of the techniques that I use are not industry standard, so take any tips you like and leave the stuff you don't. So I'm going to be covering some things that I learned from my first few times using this wax injector, and I'll leave a link down in the description to my video on making this wax injector as well. But in that video, I talked about how professional wax injection machines really make this process a lot easier. Once the temperature and pressure are dialed in, getting clean, repeatable injections seems to be pretty straightforward. But with a homemade one like this, there are a few things to consider in order to get good, repeatable results. Because pressure and temperature are a little bit harder to control with a hand-operated wax injector and a small crock pot. So I'm going to start out by getting an idea of how I'm going to arrange this design in the mold frame. And my plan is to attach the sprue to the model at the thickest section in order to hopefully reduce the chances of shrinkage or porosity when I go to cast. I'm also going to attach the sprues along the edge so that it's easier to clean up after the sprues are sawed off. Now, one thing that I think might be an issue is this small spiral. In the past, I've had issues with areas like this trapping small air bubbles in the mold. So I'm going to try making a few air vents and attach them to the inside of the mold frame, just like I showed in a previous video, in order to help the air escape. And for attaching the sprue, I'm going to be using this wax pen, which I like to use for this because I found that I tend to get a cleaner looking joint when I pick up a small amount of sticky wax with a tip and just add it to the joints where it's needed. Now, the top of the pendant is a little closer to the frame than I would like, so I'm just going to heat up a section of the sprue and bend it over slightly to put it more in the center of the frame. I'm also kind of expecting this small piece to potentially trap some air as well, because the wax will probably flow around it without a way to push the air out. So I'm going to try attaching a small amount of sticky wax to act as a gate to help fill in this area. Now I'm going to start attaching the vents using some armature wire, and I want it to attach to the inside of the mold frame, just like in my last video, venting the air out of the top of the mold. And for each side, I'm just going to quickly eyeball the amount that I should need and cut the pieces for both sides. Then I'm going to bend a small loop into the wire to help hold it to the mold frame. And instead of using tape like last time, I'm going to use a small piece of sticky wax to hold the wire to the mold frame so that I can easily adjust it into position. And for this small spiral, I want the vent to attach right at the tip of the curl to hopefully let the wax push the air all around the spiral. Then I just repeat the process for the next vent, attaching it to the top of the pendant. Now that the vents are attached and everything is nice and secure, I'm going to give it a quick shot of mold release spray to help remove the carving later on. And I'm going to be using the same Freeman brand RTV silicone as before, making sure to weigh out the two parts at the recommended 10:1 ratio. I then mixed it thoroughly, making sure to scrape the edges of the cup before putting it in the vacuum chamber for degassing. Now last time when I put the silicone in the vacuum chamber to remove the air bubbles, the silicone expanded so much that it hit the lid of the vacuum chamber. So this time I just ended up turning the chamber on its side to give me a little bit more headroom. And after pouring the silicone into the mold frame, I placed it into the vacuum chamber again before letting it cure. Now this silicone takes at least 24 hours to fully cure, and I noticed that the mold wasn't filled up quite as much as I would have liked. So I just ended up mixing up a little more, vacuuming out the air again, and adding a little bit more to the mold. After leaving it to cure for 24 hours, I can then remove it from the mold frame and start cleaning it up using an X-Acto knife to cut away any excess. And I'm going to use some metal snips to cut away the extra wire that's popping out of the top instead of pulling it out of the mold, and you'll see why in just a little bit. Then I'm going to start opening up the mold by cutting a wavy pattern all around the outside edge, making sure to not cut too close to the wax carving yet. And using my sophisticated mold prying device, I'm going to start spreading the two halves of the mold apart and gradually cut closer to the edge of the piece as I go. Now for those two vent wires, I ended up leaving them in place because I want to have the mold split open along the path of the vents so that the wax can be easily removed. And it would be pretty difficult to cut along the path by eye. However, with the wire still in place, all I need to do is run my knife along the wire and use it as a guide. And as I get closer to the wax carving, I'm taking added care to make sure that the seam of the mold is cut along the edge and not over any areas with added detail that would make cleanup more difficult. After the mold has been fully cut open, you can see the empty cavity of the wax carving and air vents. Now as far as the wax injection process goes, I'm using the same Freeman Flakes brand injection wax as I used in the past, and I'm putting the whole syringe in the pot to heat up with the wax, because if you try to suck up the wax while the syringe is cold, it'll end up cooling down and solidifying inside the syringe. I then sandwich the mold between the two pieces of acrylic to give it a more even pressure, and squeeze them together with my left hand, while using my right hand to inject the wax with the syringe, making sure to apply firm pressure with the injector for a few seconds after the mold is already filled. And after waiting a few minutes for the wax to cool, the mold can be opened and the injection can be removed. And this first injection turned out pretty well, with no trapped air bubbles. But looking at the thin tip of the pendant, it seems like the wax was just starting to solidify before filling this area. So to fix this, I'm going to try adding some talcum powder to help lubricate the wax, and turn up the heat on the crock pot just a little bit. I'm also going to try applying more pressure with a syringe to inject the wax faster. And this really seemed to do the trick. I was getting some pretty clean and consistent injections, with just the occasional flaw every so often due to user error. I can now clean up the excess wax left over from the air vents by just cutting them off with an X-Acto knife. And I found the best way to quickly smooth out these blemishes was to use my wood-burning pen and just hold it over the surface of the wax without touching it. This seemed to melt just the surface of the wax and smooth it out nice and evenly. So as you can see, this process definitely isn't the most efficient, but it can provide some good results without the need for expensive equipment. If you have any tips on making your own RTV molds, be sure to leave them down in the comments to help out others in the community. And if you're interested, make sure you subscribe to see the next video in this series where I'm going to talk about the process of casting these pieces. And as always, thanks for watching.